Thank you for including me on the program, and congratulations on what I see is a lively and very well-attended event. I couldn't attend the program today because there are several Quillette colleagues who are visiting from England, actually, and I took them to a Toronto Marlies game to introduce them to hockey, and which was a really interesting experience. At one point, one of them said to me, how come there are children on the ice? And I said, well, it's because it's intermission. And he was like, oh, yes, I see. And I said, didn't you notice that there's also a man in a giant bear suit on the ice? And he said, right. I said, you know that's not part of the game of hockey, right? Like, there's no bear in hockey. But it struck me that it would have been a great opportunity for this guy to go back, and I could have given a totally revisionist theory of hockey where both teams periodically have to escape a bear. And anyway, I'm referring to Toby Young and Jamie Palmer, two of my colleagues from Quillette. And I know, how many people in this room know what Quillette is? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. Save your applause for Claire Lehmann, who invented Quillette. And but I do know, I spoke to one or two people who maybe weren't familiar with Quillette. Quillette.com was started in 2015 by Claire. It is a web-only medium, and it's been spectacularly successful. We get, I think, more than 2 million page views on our website every month. And very much a testament to your keynote speaker's vision and success. Now, I'm in an odd position because I've been tasked with introducing my boss, which places natural limitations on the scope of my discourse. But I will say that I will use the opportunity to very briefly talk about two things about Claire that tell us a lot about some of the themes maybe you were talking about today. One is that Claire is very young. I mean, I'm 50 years old, so everybody under 40 looks young to me. But she's achieved a spectacular amount in a fairly limited amount of time, which speaks a little bit to the state of journalism. Because everybody always talks about how the journalistic industry is contracting. And it is absolutely true that the journalistic industry is contracting. Ad revenue at Canadian newspapers has gone down something like 70% over the last 10 or 15 years. But Claire's example and Quillette's example shows that there's a difference between an industry that is contracting and an industry that is in decline. Because an industry that is in decline does not attract brilliant young people starting new ventures. An industry that is in decline, by contrast, exclusively sheds capacity, and the only players left in the industry tend to be our legacy players who can leverage their monopoly to stay in the industry. Journalism is very different. It's contracting, but there are a lot of green shoots, people who are starting amazing new ventures, of which Claire is one. And I think maybe tonight she'll be talking a little bit about that. The other interesting thing about Claire is that she's from Australia. And Australia makes for a very interesting counterexample to Canada, because we often emphasize the similarities, both big, sparsely populated countries, parliamentary democracies. But Australia is a very interesting place because they don't have a United States at their border. And so much of Canadian culture and so much of Canadian defensiveness and so much of Canadian politics historically has been based around a unspoken and sometimes spoken antipathy to the United States. Australia is like a Canada that has no United States, and as a result, it has developed some fairly unique and idiosyncratic political and social aspects that simply had never developed in Canada because we were just so busy being neurotic about the United States. I would liken it by metaphor to, the kangaroo. I mean, it's just like this super weird creature that only Australia could produce. In Canada, if we produced a kangaroo, we'd say, well, what does that say about the state of socialized medicine? And it would never make it past the censor board. So I don't think it's a coincidence that that it was Australia that produced Quillette. Claire is very modest, but I'll say it, even if she wouldn't, that Claire is considered one of the leading public intellectuals in Australia. I believe there was a top 10 list that just came out, and she was on it. And if you look, Canada, I think, if you look at a defining public intellectual in Canada, it's somebody like Naomi Klein, who by the way, has written books and has extraordinary influence on the world. But one of the reasons Naomi Klein became successful and popular in Canada is she was seen as sort of the anti-American. She railed in large part against American corporate culture and against American political culture, and that helped get her start. And in that sense, she was very Canadian. What Claire has produced at Quillette is completely unique. And it's not an outgrowth of any particular strand of Australian political culture. It's an outgrowth of her own imagination and her own values. And it speaks to her imagination and the current climate that there is a huge appetite for this. That despite the fact that journalism, as I said, is contracting, she's produced something that hit a nerve, and that despite all of the websites out there, this was something, it was a demand that was being unmet. And I think during the next 15 minutes, Claire's going to help explain how she did that and some of the lessons she has for you tonight. So please welcome her to the stage.
Thank you, John. Your pay won't be docked this month. It's wonderful to be here in Canada in this gorgeous venue. And thank you, Joanna, for inviting me here. I don't really know what explains it, but Toronto has become the spiritual home of Quillette, and I think you should all be very proud, if you are locals, of the ability of your city to sort of generate heterodox thinkers and people like John Kay, Jordan Peterson. A lot of our writers at Quillette come from Toronto, so there's something very special going on here culturally. I don't exactly know what it is, but I think there's some kind of movement happening. John mentioned that Canada has many similarities with Australia, and I only recently discovered that in 1837, after a rebellion that took place in Ontario, the British rounded up your rebels and shipped them off to Australia, to Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania. So Australia is one reason why you guys are still in the Commonwealth. You can thank me for that later. So we're both far-flung British colonies, and we have the British parliamentary system. We have effective and stable democratic institutions for the most part. Like you, we do have a wealthy middle class, and we have an economy based on agriculture, services, natural resources. We export to China, you export to the US. And we're multicultural success stories, and we have selective but high immigration policies that are envied around the world. And both of our countries are beautiful. I went to Sonora Island last year where I attended a symposium, and the wilderness was absolutely spectacular, almost as spectacular as Sydney Harbour. We're also great sporting nations. My colleagues are at an ice hockey game as we speak. John has stepped out to introduce me, so thank you, John. However, not everything is positive about what we have in common. When I hear stories about bureaucratic overreach, particularly in your universities, and when I hear stories about Bill C-16, they're completely familiar to my Australian ears. We have the same problems in Australia, which many of you might not know about. Legislation that is drafted with noble intentions has ensnared innocent people into labyrinthine processes where their right to procedural fairness is neglected and breached. So in Canada, I believe these issues have been laid bare by your Bill C-16. In Australia, they have come from a part of legislation called Section 18C, which is part of our Racial Discrimination Act. So here's a story which you might not have heard about. In 2013, there were 3 university students at Queensland University in a computer laboratory. They were asked to leave the computer laboratory because it was especially reserved for Aboriginal students. Later that day, one of the students made a Facebook post where he said, "Queensland University fighting segregation with segregation." The staff member who kicked them out of the computer lab saw this Facebook post and made a complaint to the Australian Human Rights Commission about racial vilification. The complaint wasn't rejected, it was taken up. This staff member wrote legal letters to the students asking them to pay her $5,000 in order for their names to be dropped from the Human Rights Commission complaint. Most of them complied. To have your name associated with racism is reputation destroying. Many of these students had not even started their careers, and to have their names associated with racism was too risky, and $5,000 was worth the cost of getting their names taken off. The staff member sought $250,000 in damages from the Australian Human Rights Commission. She alleged that the students breached Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, which makes it unlawful to cause offence on the basis of race or ethnic origin. She said that she was unable to work for 2 years because of this Facebook post. The Human Rights Commission took this complaint to conciliation. 3 students resisted settling with this university staff member. Other students did. The complaint made it all the way to the federal court and was dismissed by a judge in the federal court. He concluded that any ordinary and reasonable member of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who had the characteristics of a fair and tolerant society would not be reasonably offended by a Facebook post about fighting segregation with segregation. The judge added that it was the practice of segregation that these students were protesting against. They were against racial discrimination more generally. Although the outcome was favourable to these students, it took 3 years for it to be completely resolved. 1 student dropped out of university, and others wasted time, money, and energy that could have been better spent elsewhere on their educations. In 2017, a much-loved, the most famous cartoonist in Australia, died after suffering a heart attack at the young age of 61. Just prior to his death, and I mean immediately prior, he had been dragged through the Commission's process for racial vilification for a cartoon that he drew for our national newspaper. The context of the cartoon is important. We had a national debate raging about the treatment of Aboriginal teenagers in our detention centres in the Northern Territory. In the Northern Territory, 97% of people who are in detention, teenagers who are in detention rather, are of Indigenous background. The overwhelming focus of the debate was on the failure of public services and the failure of public services to treat these boys humanely. But Bill Leak drew a cartoon which aims to draw attention to some of the systemic failures in these communities, such as the lack of responsibility that some parents show towards their own children. On the day that his cartoon was published, a Twitter storm erupted that engulfed the entirety of Australia's Twitter presence, which is, to be honest, only a few thousand people. Our Race Discrimination Commissioner wrote a tweet asking anyone who was offended by the cartoon to get in touch with him at the Commission. So one person did, filling out a complaint form on the Australian Human Rights Commission website before venturing off to holiday in Germany. Bill Leak was subjected to a stressful process which took months to resolve. In a submission to a Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights and Freedom of Speech in Australia, he wrote, "I was put through 2 months of incredible stress by the Commission's investigation. The first complainant, and there have been 3 now, have never met me and didn't have to justify anything they've said. No one asked her any questions, and it didn't cost her a cent. While the Commission eventually dropped the investigation after the complainant withdrew her complaint, the torturous process has thrown my life into a state of utter chaos, and it's not over yet." 3 months after the cartoon was published, 2 more complaints were received and accepted by the Commission. It appears clear that these complaints were prepared by the Aboriginal Legal Service and presented for signing by 2 Aboriginal men in the Kimberley region. So now 2 months after being notified of the first complaint and 4 months after the publication of the cartoon, the possibility that I may yet be required to defend myself in court still hovers like a dark cloud over my life. The Australian public do not know how many people each year are investigated under Section 18C. A Freedom of Information request sent by one of our think tanks found that 18 investigations were occurring at any one time. Investigations occur behind closed doors, often with the accused not being told or given an opportunity to defend him or herself. We see time and time again that in the pursuit of fashionable moral aims, due process that should be afforded individuals is sacrificed. Now, what makes Section 18C liable to vexatious and trivial complaints is its inclusion of words like offend. What causes offence now, in 2019, is not what caused offence 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and in some cases even last week. Due to this subjective wording, judges must continually reassess what is offensive with reference to current mores, which themselves are continually shifting. This is detrimental to the rule of law. It is not surprising that religious groups have lobbied the Australian government to expand Section 18C to include religion, which would surreptitiously introduce blasphemy laws into Australia under the guise of harm prevention. This is obviously detrimental to free speech. While such legislation may have been written with noble intentions, and while in theory it may seem to promote values of diversity, inclusion, and human rights, in practice, the legislation has proved to be a blunt instrument used by activist bureaucrats and vexatious complainants. It is used as a blunt instrument because the acts and behaviours which cause offence move faster and change more swiftly than does the law and even commonly agreed upon language itself. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about something called concept creep, which has occurred in psychology. And my training is in psychology, not the law, so I hope that it translates into lawyer speak. In 2016, a psychologist at the University of Melbourne, Nick Haslam, published a seminal paper on concept creep in psychology. He argued that conceptual definitions in psychology have changed substantially over time, and because these changes were incremental and gradual, many of these changes go unnoticed. It occurs when concepts expand both horizontally and vertically, horizontally referring to brand new phenomena that wasn't included in the definition before, and vertically by including qualitatively less extreme phenomena, that is, diluting the meaning of the word over time. Haslam identified many instances where concept creep had expanded definitions, such as the definition of trauma, abuse, harm, prejudice, bullying, addiction, even the concept of a mental disorder itself. Concept creep only ever goes in one direction, and that is towards expanding a concept to become more broad and the definition to become more diluted. It never goes the other way into narrowing a definition to become more precise. It has not only impacted the definitions of trauma, abuse, offence, bullying and addiction. This process has profoundly impacted the definitions of racism, the words racism, sexism, sexual harassment, homophobia, transphobia, and in some cases even sexual assault. This continual expansion of the definition of words has implications for the legal profession. A good example which I looked into recently is sexual harassment. A few decades ago, sexual harassment referred to sexual intimidation and coercion in the workplace, targeting an individual. Repeated sexual comments, slurs, derogatory comments were behaviours that fell under the umbrella of sexual harassment. Today, the definition is much more expansive. For a number of years now, activists, social science researchers, among others, have included something called gender harassment as a subtype of sexual harassment. So it's not a separate thing in and of itself, it's lumped in with sexual harassment. Gender harassment does not have to be sexual, and it does not have to target an individual. Gender harassment can include any remark that is perceived as stereotyping or hostile to a particular gender. For example, in the context of tech workplaces in Silicon Valley, if you write a memo arguing that men and women, on average, have different occupational preferences, and maybe that these average differences mean that fewer women are interested in coding or computer science, then this makes one guilty of gender harassment, and by definition now, sexual harassment. And if you think this is hyperbole or is just a hypothetical situation, think again. One of my writers, a computer science professor, has been investigated by his university for sexual harassment for writing an essay arguing that the average occupational differences between men and women means that we'll never get 50-50 parity in fields like computer science. James Damore was sacked by his employer Google for making similar arguments. Making an argument and publishing an essay is not sexual. It doesn't target an individual, but under the new definition of sexual harassment, this is included. I recently read a report released by the National Academies of Science in the United States, which argued that treating women differently in the workplace was sexual harassment. In another part of the report, several pages later in a different section, it said that not treating women differently was a form of sexual harassment in the context of women's greater caring responsibilities. So we're getting to a point where definitions have become so expansive that they lose logical consistency. So concept creep does not just occur in the discipline of psychology, it's occurring all over the place. In the United States, academics who study critical race theory now propose that colour blindness, that is not seeing race, is a form of racism. The University of California lists statements such as, "I don't see race," "There is only one race, the human race," as examples of microaggressions, a new term which describes low-level slights and offences that are perceived as offensive by racial minorities and other marginalised people. So defining colour blindness as racist is not just an example of concept creep. I would say this is an example of concept inversion. We are living in strange times. All of us sitting here can remember in our lifetimes where treating people equally was the ideal. Ranking people according to race was considered racism. These were the ideals of the second half of the 20th century. Unfortunately, it looks like these late 20th century ideals are being replaced by a new form of 21st century tribalism. When students at a Queensland student university laboratory complained on Facebook about racially segregated computer labs, the Australian Human Rights Commission investigated them for racial vilification. When a cartoonist drew a cartoon wanting to draw attention to the lack of personal responsibility in some systemic abuses occurring in the Northern Territory in Aboriginal communities, he was investigated for racial vilification. Concept creep can expand to make psychological terms more accurate and more sensitive to harm, but it can also lead concepts to become overly broad, incoherent, and used as weapons by actors in an ongoing culture war. Now, we can't control the subcultures within communities, activist and academic communities, but we can control the subcultures in other professions. So I would urge all of you as the gatekeepers of the legal profession to be aware of concept creep and to be aware of the shifting definitions and the impact of language on your practice in law, and to be aware that sometimes these words that we think are commonly agreed upon, such as racism and sexism and sexual harassment, some of these terms are shifting in their definition, and that this may have serious implications for how law is practiced and may have serious implications for administrative and regulatory processes in your country. There's not much we can do about the corruption that has occurred in various academic and activist circles, but we can preserve the integrity and the consistency of how we can preserve the integrity of our legal professions. But in doing so, we're going to have to be alert to these threats and to be ready when those tasked with bureaucratic those tasked with writing legislation want to include words which may open up to shifting over time. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
If anybody has any questions, Claire is happy to take them. The mic is back there.
So I'll just do my part of thanking you for being here. I really enjoyed your speech. I would also like to hear you speak all night because your voice is beautiful. So we have kind of talked a lot at this conference about the idea of, different ideals in society evolving and kind of the living tree versus dead tree doctrine, that kind of thing. Do you see what you talk about of concept creep? Do you see there being no place for definitions to evolve, or do you see it to be something that should be constrained to reasonable limits? Because I see that there also can be ways that we can view that the past definition maybe was incorrect and we need to reevaluate that. So I just wanted your response on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that definitely, if you look at the way the meaning of bullying has changed or the meaning of abuse, it makes sense that the definitions have changed once we've become more aware of different kinds of abuse and there's been more empirical investigation, and we can see that different types of abuse, such as emotional abuse or even severe neglect, is actually very harmful and just as harmful as physical abuse. I think that is reasonable. I would just be wary of using words that can be interpreted subjectively into legislation, in considering that these words, if you use the word offence, considering that what causes offence now will be something different in 5 or 10 years from now, and we don't know what might be offensive. So I think it's about not using concepts or words where the definition is likely to expand in legislation.
Okay. So in that, do you think that we should create like new concepts when we're creating new ideas as opposed to having that bit of confusion?
Well, I think if you look at section 18C, and it's unlawful to cause offence on the basis of someone's race, and I think something similar is written in Bill C-16, where you can't cause offence on the basis of gender identity. I think it's probably not the wisest thing to put subjective interpretations, bake it so fundamentally into the legislation. Legislation should be able to be interpreted objectively, and it shouldn't have to rely on someone else's internal state for it to have meaning.
So just keeping an eye on like the words that we choose is mostly. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you for coming. It's great to have you here.
Thanks.
I wonder if you would take us back to the moment when you decided to launch Quillette and what was in your head and what you thought might come of it. To tell us, what in heaven's name you were thinking, and perhaps give us an indication about whether you have a journalistic background, the state of the play in that profession, and how much that weighed on your mind in terms of launching the site.
Okay. I don't have a background in journalism. I was a psychology student, and I was a grad student in psychology. I was doing my master's in forensic psychology, and I had a baby at home, which was making the completion of my master's quite difficult. But while I was doing my master's, I started writing blog posts. I created a blog, and then I started writing op-eds for the Sydney Morning Herald, a newspaper in Sydney. And I really enjoyed writing. It was much more fulfilling to me than practicing psychology at the clinic where I was doing an internship. And so I thought, well, perhaps writing is for me. How do I make money out of being a writer? Well, you can't. And so I thought, how do you make money out of a casino? You own the casino. So I thought, if I'm going to pursue writing, I've got to own my own company, and so I decided to do that. But to be honest, I created the website on a whim. I had just dropped out of my master's course, and I was quite upset about that. And I just created it as a joke, really. I mean, not as a joke, but on a whim. And I was brainstorming with my husband one night, names for a website, and I came up with Quillette, and the domain name was free, so I bought it, and the rest is history. Luckily, I had a good network of smart people who wanted to write for me. So I think that has been the secret to our success, is just the network effect of knowing a few people in my immediate social circle, and that building out over time.
Hi, thank you for coming. I really enjoyed your presentation, and
Thanks.
I especially wanted to mention just how much I enjoyed Sad Radicals in December.
Oh, okay, great. Yes,
Connor
great
Barnes
piece.
it was a very good article. I recommend it. I've shared it twice today already with people I've spoken with, so thank you. And just for providing this forum. Something you said, I just wanted to share an experience. I was in law school a few years ago. I finished in 2015, and in my American constitutional law class, it was said by one of the students, as a matter of fact, well, now that we know that there's no such thing as race, why don't people understand there's no such thing as gender? Like, it's just a matter of time, right? And so I'm a little bit shocked at how recently we are so far behind already in Canada understanding that no such thing as race is actually erroneous. Like, I just can't keep up. So I'm really glad you're here to help me be more woke to this. And, I don't know what to do now, but I'll do my best to try to stay on top of things. But thank you. And I do have one question.
Yeah.
You shared with us some of the sufferings of people who have been, perhaps you're modest, but surely you've suffered from taking on this role, and so at least have our thanks maybe for future suffering if you haven't had suffering already, but thank you for providing the forum you do.
Oh, thank you. Cheers. Thanks. No, I actually haven't suffered, people often ask me if I've ever experienced backlash for creating Quillette and for sharing my opinions publicly and that type of thing, but I honestly haven't. If anything, the positive outcome vastly shadows over any negative outcome whatsoever, like 100 to 1. Like the positive response that we have through creating Quillette and through publishing the essays that we publish has been extremely positive. And so I would encourage anyone who is feeling timid, feeling afraid of expressing some unfashionable or heterodox or controversial ideas to go ahead and express them. I think you'll be surprised at the positive response you will receive. That being said, I am aware of the James Damore situation, and I am aware that one of my writers was investigated by his university. But those are isolated cases, and I would say that on the whole, the backlash is much less than is expected by most people. So I think the fear is outsized comparative to the risk.
Thank you, Claire. I'm sure you saw Barry Weiss had a great piece in the New York Times last week where she referred to Australia as Canada in a thong.
I did.
And I would say all of her observations about Australia indeed apply to Canada, that there are places that are delightful to live and perhaps suffer a bit from tall poppy mediocrity syndrome. Mm-hmm. And yet, Quillette has its physical home in Australia, spiritual home in Toronto, and the Canadian public intellectual that everybody was thinking about when John Kay called out Naomi Klein was Jordan Peterson. So I wonder why it is that two societies such as ours seem to be so intellectually fertile, and what the dichotomy between mediocrity and innovation.
Well, I think one factor might be that we're relatively outward looking, at least in Australia, because we're so isolated. On the one hand, we are very parochial and provincial and inward looking, but on the other hand, we're very aware of our space in the world, and we're very aware that there's a lot going on in Europe and the United States. And so I don't think we get an inflated sense of self-importance, and so we come from a position of humility almost automatically. And I think that allows one to potentially question orthodoxies and fashionable trends and groupthink more easily when, you're not overconfident in your own culture, so you take a more skeptical and critical position from the outset. I think that could be one factor. Another factor is that we just have a lot of human capital, and personally I think that Australia punches below its weight. We have the 13th biggest economy in the world. We've got a lot of really brainy people, and I think we could be doing a whole lot more culturally. That being said, the lifestyle is lovely, and people are looking after their families, and they're enjoying their lives and their hobbies, and sometimes it's just a matter of the struggle isn't there, so we're not producing the Dostoevskys and the people who have to really overcome struggle through producing art. So it might just be that we have it so good that there isn't such need for public intellectualism and that type of thing. But I think we could be doing a lot more. You probably would say the same.
Hello, Claire. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your publication.
Thanks.
My question has to do with changing definitions and why some words lose their meaning. I noticed that worldviews have their own lexicon, and that as the times change, either that lexicon has to add new words or the existing words have to, I guess, expand so that they remain relevant to the facts of the day. And I also notice with a related concept like the euphemistic treadmill, where you introduce a new word as a euphemism and it organically degenerates back into an epithet. And I'm just wondering, have you made any psychological connections on these issues? What can be done I guess do you just notice the word as it slides into this decategorization and eventually poof, it's meaningless? Or what? I'm still working this out. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one reason why some words undergo concept creep is because the words themselves are used as weapons or tools by people who are playing a specific game, and that game might be to win a political fight, win a culture war, or even just advocate on the behalf of certain people, victims or marginalised groups. So the priority is not truthfulness and using a word with its specific intended meaning or even everyday common language meaning. The goal of the game is to win something in a fight for the victims that you're advocating on behalf of. So the people who will use these words will not prioritise truthfulness, and they'll prioritise winning above other considerations, and therefore the words may be used in an over-expansive, over-broad, or even completely unusual manner. Philosophers have spent a long time figuring out the root meaning of words, and I don't know if that work still occurs in philosophy departments in universities, but I think there's a huge scope for more work on this subject, considering that words are moving so fast in the contemporary climate.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask you a question. It's a tad specific, though.
Yeah.
What 3 cultural social developments would you think explain this concept creep, or this concept inversion, as you put it, that we have been seeing over the past, say, 10 to 20 years? You could take that broadly or in a micro fashion, as you'd like.
Well, I'm pretty persuaded by the arguments of people like Jonathan Haidt of the Heterodox Academy, and there's been quite a lot of discussion about how academia has become more homogenous over the last few decades and becoming overwhelmingly left-tilted. And I think this happened after the 1960s, when a lot of baby boomers who were oriented towards the left went into the academy, and they've stayed there. And some of the old generation of scholars who may have been more libertarian or conservative have sort of either retired or died or just left the academy. So what we see now is a very homogenous left to hard left academy. And the impact that is having on the culture is what happens in the university, what happens in academia comes into the broader culture sort of years down the track. So I would say that's the main factor driving some of this stuff, and that's why the definitions are becoming more sensitive to harm rather than less sensitive to harm. So if you imagine a university system which is only conservatives and only libertarians, perhaps concept creep would happen in the other direction, and words would become narrower, and we would cut out things like neglect from the definition of abuse. Do you know what I mean? I think it's simply because academia has swung or shifted so far leftward, and there's so few academics and individuals within academia to sort of balance it out and question some of the confirmation biases that are occurring in those settings. Yeah.
Hi, Claire. Thanks again for your talk. It was a great talk. My question has to do with some of the driving principles that I see behind Quillette, a lot of its writers and readers, which is quite focused on the individual. Phrases like classical liberalism will come up.
Yeah.
But in a lot of traditionally liberal countries, right, we're seeing a lot of fluctuation, which is based on class divides, cultural conflicts, and even a lot of the trends that you've brought up seem to be kind of Band-Aid solution oftentimes to these things. And other countries, Eastern Europe, we're seeing a very different, very illiberal response. But even a place like Singapore, right? Diverse, productive, peaceful country, but far more restrictive, I would say, than probably most Quillette readers would like to see. I'm wondering how you think a stabilization can occur that would be more amenable to your readers from a more individually based framework, or in the context of the fact that a lot of these traditionally liberal countries don't seem to be able to do it in the present time. Thank you.
No problem. I honestly don't have a clear answer to the problems that have been identified within liberalism. I think that's an ongoing project. But I did write an editorial around Christmas time, which encouraged people to celebrate the religious holidays and ceremonies and rituals that are associated with religion, even if they're atheist, because it brings our communities together and reinforces the social glue which create our cohesive and harmonious communities. So I think it's a big question and it's an ongoing project. But I think that there's a lot to be said about the new movement of atheists rediscovering the cultural practices within religions. I think that there's quite a fruitful avenue there.
Hi. Thank you for bringing up this concept of concept creep and concept inversion. I think it's a useful tool. But I ask myself if creep and inversion is really the problem. In a way, creep in and of itself can be a useful thing. I think of the definition of person in Canada. There's the famous persons case from our Supreme Court where the definition was expanded to include women, and I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
And I think of inversion. I think of Soviets being an experiment in radical democracy and now having, an association with totalitarianism. So isn't really the problem more that these new concepts that you discussed have become dogmatic and unfalsifiable?
Yeah, that's a good way of framing it, and perhaps you're right. It could be that there is no problem with definitions expanding and becoming more flexible and inclusive if they're not held so dogmatically. What I find most problematic is a practice where if you take people who use this new meaning, this new understanding of racism to mean colour blindness, not seeing race, using that definition of racism and then at the same time using the old 20th century definition of racism to then try and ping people for doing the wrong thing. And I think you'll find a lot of the time the people who use the newer definitions of these words will also try and rely on the older definitions at the very same time. And this can be confusing for everybody because most people are believing that we're all on the same page, we're all on the late 20th century page where treating people equally is the ideal, and words such as sexism, racism, and other phobias have the same, we all understand what they mean, and then all of a sudden people are getting in trouble for things they didn't know were offensive or were microaggressions, and the people trying to get them into trouble are using the new meaning, but then trying to go through the avenues where the old meanings actually have some teeth, if that makes sense. So it's trying to have your cake and eat it too, I think, is the problem.
Thank you so much.
We can't keep Claire so late. She came all the way from Sydney. Thank you so much for your remarks. And thank you to all of you for being here and participating so thoughtfully all weekend. It's been a delight to be with you. Please stick around.